Might take a second for the stream to start to actually show to everyone else. But I only have one level indicator now, so I think it's coming in through both. So if you could confirm for me in the chat that you can hear me in both ears, that would be great. And once we have that, we'll get started. Awesome. Okay. Great. Sounds better. That's great. Cool. All right. So like I said, welcome everyone to a new series I'm going to try and do on my Twitch channel. I'm going to try and do this regularly. It's called Swiftly Built, and the idea here is to build something from scratch and show all the steps. So I will be recording this. Twitch should be automatically recording this for me, and then I'll be posting it on YouTube afterwards. So if you don't get to hang out with me live, there will be an archive of these videos on YouTube kind of for posterity so that you can watch them later. So today, what we're going to be using, talking to Kelly, that's fine. You can answer. So today what we're going to be building is a game. And we're going to build the game Simon. If you are old enough to be a kid from the 90s, it was a game that I think came out in the late 80s and then got kind of updated in the early 90s. And I tweeted about a little commercial from the early 90s that I actually remember watching when I was a kid and seeing it on TV about this game called Simon. So it's a pretty simple game. Basically, it shows different buttons. It's a physical product that had actual buttons that were different colors. And the idea was that it would play back a series of colors and lights, or series of colors and sounds, and you were supposed to follow along and tap those same values. And if you got it right, you got more points, and eventually it would get long enough, and I believe it got faster too. Eventually it would get too complicated, and you wouldn't be able to remember all of that, and you would make a mistake, and then your game would be over, but you'd get some kind of a high score, and the idea was to get a better score than everybody else. So let me boot up my simulator real quick, and I'll show you the completed version of the project, of the app. Yeah, I realized it was around in the 80s, right? I'm a 90s kid, and the commercial that I remember is from the early 90s, but it's been around for a while. So let me go ahead and boot this up for you, and I will show you the completed version of the app, and then we'll just get off. We'll start off by building the project one step at a time. So it just takes a second for this to boot up. So there's a question in the chat about, am I making it all in Swift or some part in SwiftUI and Vector-C? For this particular app, we're going to just focus on UIKit and Swift. But the idea here is that as we kind of finish that up and switch to the next project, we might tackle SwiftUI. I've actually thought about maybe not right after this one, since we will have just done Simon. Maybe a couple apps down the road, we could try revisiting this game and building it again, but using SwiftUI that time. So that would be pretty fun. For today and for this first series, we're going to focus on UIKit and Swift, but we'll explore different things. And in part, I'm really excited about DubDub this year, WWDC. It's happening in the end of June. We should be hearing all kinds of cool things about new SwiftUI stuff and things they've fixed and new features and stuff. So I'm excited to explore that, and I'm sure we'll be able to play with those things on the stream as well and learn about that. So for the game, we've got just a basic leaderboard here. It's obviously blank when you first start because there's no scores. And so when you hit new game, it brings up an interface, and then it plays back a single instance. You didn't hear it. It came through my speakers, but it plays a little tone, and it lights up that button. It changes the color of that button. So then when you tap that, and if it's right, then obviously it adds an additional step to the sequence. And then it asks you to play those back right for it. You get 10 points for every button you get right. And if you make a mistake, then it considers the game to be over. And it tells you that the game is over. It gives you your total score. And it asks you to put in your initials. And if you do that and hit to the leaderboard, then it will close that game screen, take you to the leaderboard, show you your score, and then give you the opportunity to start a new game. So that is the basic playback of the game and the logic that we're going to follow. So there's a lot actually involved with that, a lot more than you might think. It looks pretty straightforward and pretty simple, and it is for the most part, but there is a lot more there than you might think. So we're going to get to explore all of that and understand how the logic is built and how we get the game to function. Cool. Yeah, it's coming through my speaker, so it's probably being picked up by my mic. And actually, I think the desktop audio is connected, so you might actually be able to hear that anyway. All right, so let's start from the beginning and let's build a brand new project. So how we do that is I've got multiple screens pulled up, so you can't see the Xcode application, sort of the menu, but I'll drag a new one over here, and now you can see it onto the one that I'm sharing. So this is Xcode, if you've never seen it before. This is the application that we use as iOS developers to build iOS applications. You can use it to build iOS, Mac, tvOS, which is the apps that run on the Apple TV, and watchOS apps. You can also use it to build games and stuff too. So it's free on the Mac App Store. If you have a Mac, you can download the Xcode IDE, or Integrated Development Environment, on the App Store for free. And to get a new project, you just go to File, New, and then Project. And when you do that, you get this little template chooser. And so there's several different iOS templates you can pick from. The one that we're going to pick today is just Single View App, because that's what we're going to start with. And then we'll kind of add to that from there. So we're going to hit Next. And then I'm going to change over to just have no team. And then we're going to give this a name of Simon. And I'm going to just change this to my name. And then I'll change this to my name as well. So these steps are just kind of configuration steps for building a project and kind of getting it ready to go. So you have your product name, you have your team, which would be if you were part of an Apple development team, meaning that your company or maybe you individually have an Apple developer account. You can assign that right then and there, and then you will be able to upload apps to Test Flight and getting them for beta testing and also for release to the App Store. The org name would be, if you had a company, you could put the company's name in there, or you could put your own name. And then the identifier is a way to uniquely identify every app. So every app on the App Store has a unique ID. It's called the bundle identifier, and that's listed here below. And it's a combination of usually the word com, dot, and then either the name of yourself or the name of your company, and then lastly the name of the app. So you can see here it says .simon at the end. The language is Swift. You have options of Swift or Objective-C. Those are the two languages we use to build apps on iOS. And then lastly, we've got Storyboard and Swift UI. It used to be just Storyboard, but with last year's introduction of Swift UI, we have a whole new way to build apps now. So like I said, for this time, we're going to focus on UIKit and the Storyboard and stuff like that, but we'll come around to using Swift UI at some point. Next. So here, this is where you're going to save your project. So typically you want to have a single spot that you do that. It's nice to just be organized. I'm just going to put this on my desktop for now. I'll probably actually no, because I already have a copy of it. Let me put it in, I'll just put it in Documents. I'm also going to go ahead and say create Git repository on my Mac. What that will do is it turns this project into a Git repo, which is pretty cool. That's source control, which is a thing that we use as developers to track the changes of our apps over time. Think of it kind of like breadcrumbs. So as you make edits to your files, as you change the code itself, you can kind of have save points. Like if you're playing a game, right? You finish a level or maybe even get halfway through a level. You want to make sure that you save so that if you leave and come back, you can start from that spot and not start back at the beginning. It's the same idea basically as having multiple save points in your project. What's really cool though is that you have access to all those previous save points. So if at some point you travel down a path with your code and decide, you know what, this is not a good way to solve this problem, I want to back up, you can use Git to go backwards in time to a previous point in your development cycle where maybe the app worked and you traveled down a path that it didn't work. You can just back up to a known working spot and then erase that stuff that you were doing and travel down a different path, right, and try and solve the problem in a different way. It's a very common scenario when you're developing code is that you're going to probably have lots and lots of different attempts to solve something, and it isn't always going to work the first time. And so you want to have a way to track that over time and then change it if you need to. All right, so we've got our project. We've got a Git repository, which is pretty great. It built it for us automatically. And at this point, this is the Xcode main Xcode window for a project. And what it defaults you to is this very first thing up here in the upper left corner. So the left panel that you see over on this side is called the Navigator. And it has a whole bunch of different tabs that can give you all kinds of information about your project. And that first item up here at the top usually has the name of your app. This is all the project properties. So this tells you things like what iOS target are you targeting, right? Which OS version are you targeting? And it defaults you to the most recent one, which is 13.4. Are you going to support iPhone and iPad or not, right? You can just choose one or the other. You can choose both. You can also now choose Mac. There's, as of 10.15, as of Catalina, the latest version of Mac OS. It's been changed name. It used to be called OS 10. So Mac OS now allows you to build a single app that works on the iPhone, the iPad, and the Mac all at the same time. It's pretty cool. We're not going to turn that on for now, but that is an option. And then you have things like, does the app support landscape, right? So can you go both portrait? Can you go landscape? Are you going to support those things? For our app and the way that it works, the way that the layout works, it just would look very strange and squished if we did it in landscape. So for this app, we're actually going to just turn off landscape. And then we're also going to go ahead and turn off iPad for now. And we could, add iPad support at some point in the future. But for now, we're going to kind of focus on this being an iPhone app. So it's an iPhone app, and it's only going to be available in portrait. And that's really just because of the way that we're designing the UI. We don't really want to support landscape because if you went landscape with this, it would just look very squished and strange. So we're going to force the user to only let it be used in in portrait. All right, so that's our basic setup for our project. Now we're going to dig into the design. And basically what we're going to do here is we're going to go for an hour-ish, and we'll get as far as we get. And whatever we don't complete tonight, we'll just do again on another night. Tentatively, I'm planning on streaming on Mondays and Thursdays. We'll see. I might have to adjust that here and there, but that's kind of the general plan. So whatever we don't finish tonight, we'll just pick this up. And if you join me again on this coming Monday, we will continue working with this from there. My plan is to post this on GitHub and show you all the steps and give you all the code. So feel free to follow along with me if you'd like. If you'd like to build your app as I build mine, that's cool. And if not, if you just want to watch, you can do that too. And I will make sure to get you the links to GitHub once we get it up there. And then what I'm going to do is, as we build it, I'm just going to keep adding to that repository. And so you'll get the changes kind of as I make them. Oh, Nightbot. So my channel has historically been used for hosting the local Orlando iOS meetup and streaming it. So Khalif very, very fortunately set up Nightbot for me, but it is kind of defaulting to iOS Orlando. So check out our GitHub page if you'd like for the meetup. But I will also have the links for this repository, and I'll even show you how I'm going to get it on GitHub. So when we're done for this evening, that's probably the last thing that I'll do is actually push this up to GitHub, and I'll show you those steps as well. We're not going to skip anything. All right, so the first thing we're going to do is go into the storyboard, and we're going to start working on the UI. So from a design point of view, we need to create a design. And what I'm going to do, I'm actually going to grab the design from my completed project. Let's take a screenshot of it. And then we can kind of refer to that as our design document. So what you might imagine here is that, hang on, let me open preview. You might imagine that you get a design spec from a designer, right? That you might have something that is basically, this is what we want you to build. And what we're going to give you is just essentially just a bunch of pictures, right? We're going to give you pictures that show you what it looks like. And then you as the developer are responsible to create it. If you're lucky, right? If you're lucky, you're going to get design specs. And if you're not, you're going to get like a hand-wavy, just wordy description of what they want. Like, I want it like this. It should be like, I want it to look like the Uber app crossed with the Chick-fil-A app, right? They're just going to give you like this very vague description. That's if you're not so lucky. If you are lucky, you'll get something like this, which is basically a design spec for what it's supposed to look like. This actually is even a little more so because this was a screenshot from Xcode from my other window. So you'll get, in this case, we're getting even a little more information. But in general, you should get at least kind of an idea of what the screen is supposed to look like. So we're going to start with that menu screen that you see here. This is kind of the main menu of the game. And you can see, pretty simple. We only have 2 screens in this app. It's not a very complicated structure as far as the views that we're going to show. It's just the menu, and then it's the game board. And so you either are in the main menu or you're playing a game. That's pretty much it. And that was on purpose, right? This app is pretty straightforward and pretty simple, and that was on purpose on my part. Wanted to start out with something pretty straightforward, and we can kind of dig into more complicated things as we go. Also, I'm going to try and do when we get a little closer to this app being done, I'm going to run a poll on the Twitch stream to get your feedback and input on what you'd like me to work on after this as our second app. So you'll have input as well on what we should work on after this. This was in some ways kind of a test to see how this whole system works, right? So let's work on building the main menu first. We've got basically just 3 things that we need to worry about here. We have actually 4 things. We have the title of the game, right? So Simon. We've got a little header that shows what the data is going to look like when we fill in the table. We've got the table itself, which is going to have rows of scores. And then at the very bottom, we have a big button that lets the user create a new game. So with design, you really want to kind of draw the eye from top to bottom, or really kind of in whatever direction makes sense for you for your app. And you want to make sure that it's very clear what the user can do, right? So pretty much the top 2/3 of this screen is just for information purposes. It's showing you what the scores are. And really the only thing that they can do is to create a new game. So we want to make sure that that call to action is very large, very prominent, very obvious, so that it's very clear how to start a new game, and that is the kind of the one thing that you can do from this screen. So we're going to make that button be very large and very prominent, and everything else is going to kind of feed off of that. So let's start with that button. And once we get it on the screen, we can then kind of build from there. So we're actually, in this case, even though they're probably going to look at it from top to bottom, we're going to design from bottom to top. Okay, so the first thing we have to do is get a button on the screen. And there are a lot of controls that are built right into iOS. So rather than having to kind of maybe build them all yourself, you can do that. You can build custom things. But there's a whole bunch there's just like a toolbox of a bunch of different things that are built right in. So if you press this plus button right here in the interface and towards the upper right of the screen, and I think if you look at it, you can mouse over it, it gives you a tooltip. It's called the library. So if you click that button, you get this window. But if you want to be a real dev, right, you learn all the keyboard shortcuts. So Command-Shift-L on your Mac keyboard, that's the wrong thing, Command-Shift-L will bring up that same library, and that way you don't have to use your mouse. You can just use the keyboard. So Command-Shift-L is the shortcut for that. All right, once we have that, we then want to type in button, and then it shows you all the buttons that you can pick from. We're going to pick just a regular old button and drag it onto the canvas. It actually is that easy. This interface is called the storyboard, and it is a visual designer. It's something that not every platform has, not every application platform has, but iOS does. It's really nice and very, very powerful. Has drawbacks and it's not perfect, and it isn't always the right answer to every problem UI-wise, but it's a great way to get started, if nothing else. So we're going to use this tonight to build our UI, and we want this button pretty near the bottom. So we're going to just sort of generally place it there, and then we're going to use some rules to make sure that it goes where we want it to go when the app runs. But for now, we'll just kind of stick it more or less near the bottom, and then we're going to double click on it and change the name. So we're going to say that this button is now the new game button. So we just double click on it, type in new game, you now get a little blue button with blue text that says new game. So that's pretty good for a start, but for one thing, I'd like it to be bigger. I'd like it to be more obvious what it is, right? I'd like to have a sort of a nice background. By default, iOS buttons have no background color, and they just simply have colored text, which is fine, but it's often not super obvious to users that it's even clickable necessarily. So a lot of times on iOS for buttons like this, you will give it a background color to make it more obvious. So that's what we're going to do. The right panel that you see here, and I have it already open, but you can open and close it with this button in the upper right corner, is called the inspector. And the inspector, just like the navigator on the left, has a whole bunch of tabs. It has a whole bunch of different things you can pick from to configure things. Think of the navigator as what it sounds like, right? It lets you navigate around in your project. The inspector is named that way because it lets you inspect things, right? It lets you look inside and look at the settings and change things about different items that you click on. So if I click on the button and I get these little boxes around it, it's highlighted. And now the inspector is showing me information about that button specifically. In fact, the third from the right tab is called the Attributes Inspector. It has all the attributes about this button. So it lets you change whatever you want, the text, the font, the font size, the text color, all kinds of things. If we scroll down towards the bottom, this option down here that says background lets you change the background color of the button. So we're just going to scroll through this and look at them. There's a whole bunch of built-in colors now. This is an iOS 13 specific feature. They're called semantic colors, and it's pretty cool. They give you some built-in colors. We're just going to pick, I think I picked indigo, so we're going to pick the system indigo color from the list, and that will change it to that kind of dark purple color. And of course, now the text really clashes with the purple color. It makes it, in fact, almost impossible to read. So we're going to go ahead and come up here to text color and change this to white, wherever that is, down toward the bottom. So that way it's easier to read the text again. So we've just changed the background color and the text color to make that button stand out more, be more obvious. And now you might be asking, well, in the finished version, right, and then in the design, the button is much bigger than this. On iOS, buttons they have an intrinsic size, so they default to a size that is basically large enough to display the text within the button. Or if the button is icon-based, if it's an image-based button, then it's enough to make sure that the image can be displayed in its entirety. And then they usually have a little bit of extra padding. So as you can see, there's padding on the top and the bottom, but on the left and the right, there is basically no padding, right? As soon as the N begins and the E ends, the button kind of has its edges. So we want to expand that out and make it larger, make it more prominent. The way that we do that is we assign what are called constraints. And constraints are a way to tell the system what something is, where it's positioned, and also how big it is. So position and size. And so this is similar to CSS. If you have any experience with HTML and sort of web development, CSS does largely the same thing with HTML, right? You can define what the thing is, right? You can maybe make a p tag or a heading or something. And then once you have that defined in your HTML, you can go into your CSS and say, I want that to be a certain size, a certain font size, a certain color. You can define those kind of attributes about how big it is and all that kind of stuff. The same thing is true here as far as position and size. The constraint system, which is called auto layout on iOS, allows you to do the exact same thing. It lets you just define the position and the size. So we're going to make this much larger by setting up some constraints. So to do that, you click on the item that you want to add a constraint to, and then you go over here. I call this a TIE Fighter because the button looks kind of like a TIE Fighter from Star Wars. It's actually called the Add New Constraints button. So if you click on that, you get a little window that pops up. And this window represents constraints that you can add to the four corners, right? Sorry, the four edges of the button in this case. And so this little black box is like an analog for the thing that you are trying to add constraints for. It's right, any given view that might be in the system. What we're going to do here is we're going to add some constraints to what are called the leading and trailing edges. That's the left and right side of the button. And we're going to set those values to 0, meaning that there's no margin, there's no offset from that. It's just the leading edge of the button should be aligned with the leading edge of the screen, and the same thing for the trailing. So we're going to do that for the leading and trailing. And then the bottom, we're going to turn on the bottom constraint, and we're going to give this a margin of 20 points. We want to push that up from the bottom of the screen by 20 points. So we'll do that, and we'll hit Add 3 Constraints. You see that makes the button much wider, and then it also makes it kind of push up from the bottom of the screen by 20 points. And when I say bottom of the screen, I don't actually mean the very bottom of the screen, right? Like the bottom of this little bar is pretty far away from the bottom of the screen. So why is that? The reason why is because on the iPhone 10 series phones, so all the phones that have the notch, right? All the phones that are full screen or have the rounded corner screens. There's several models of those. All of those have a home indicator. They no longer have a home button. They just have a home indicator gesture area. We want to keep all of our controls away from that. We don't want our controls to be too close to that area because our controls might interfere with the home screen, the home button controls, right? The home indicator, and that'd be bad, right? We'd be fighting between our app and the system, and there could be confusion around that. And it might not make it work properly. So we want to stay away from that area, and that's why this view has something called a safe area, an area that is guaranteed to be useful and visible to the user for you, the developer, to draw your elements inside of. So the bottom of the safe area is actually right here where this little bar ends, and the rest of the screen is actually reserved just for the OS. Let me turn off my notifications. So the bottom of the screen is reserved for the home indicator. And the same thing is true at the top, right? On the iPhone 10 series phones, so that's a whole bunch of models. There is the notch, right? And then there's also kind of what they call the ears. I've heard them called the ears, sort of the area of the screen on the left and the right side. That's all pretty much reserved for OS stuff, right? So the time and the battery on the left and right. And then the notch is a physical limitation, right? In theory, you could actually have elements on the screen at areas that are way up here underneath the notch, right? But in reality, there's no screen there. It's in theory addressable, but it's not actually an area that you could see anything if you placed like a button or an element up at that point. So again, the safe area for this is down a little bit to keep you away from those top and bottom areas so that all of your content is visible and useful. Okay. So we've got a button on the screen, and it's wide but not very tall. So let's fix the height problem by making it taller. We're going to click on that same Add New Constraints button, and this time we're going to add just a height constraint. So some constraints are going to relate to other views, like in this case, the leading and the trailing connected the button to the screen, right? It's a relationship between the button and the screen. In this case, the height constraint is just sort of relating it to itself, right? I'm just saying that the button itself is going to be so many points tall. That's really all we're doing. So we're going to turn that on, and I'm going to change this to 80. We're going to make it pretty tall. Add one constraint. It makes the button much taller. All right. So we've got a button. It's pretty good. But if we look at the design, the text is too small, right? The text in the design is much bigger. And I'm actually also now realizing that it looks like I constrained the button to the table view. That's why it's not quite full width. So we can either keep it the way it is or we can change it later. But at a minimum, the button text is too small, right? It doesn't match the design. Again, if you're in a good situation and you have a designer and you can even talk to them, you might go ask them, or you might get that information from them. They might have sent it to you, what font size they actually used on that button. Otherwise, you're guessing. So that is, again, if you're in a good scenario, you'll have that data. If you're not in a good scenario, you'll have to guess. We don't have to guess, though, because I wrote this app and I have the completed version on my other screen, so there's no guessing involved. I can just tell you what it is. To change the font of a button, you click on the button, and you go over here to the font area of the Attributes Inspector. Click on the little T. It brings up a window, and then that window lets you change both the font itself, so I can go, like, for example, from system to custom, and then that opens me up to all of the options that are available to me on iOS, all the built-in fonts. But we're just going to use the system font this time. That's fine. And then it lets you change both the weight and the size. Apple calls the weight the style, but that in most other systems is called the font weight. It's basically how thick each letter is. So we're going to pick here bold weight, and then the size is going to be 24. That pumps up the size of the text so that it is the same size as what we have in our design. And now it's just a much better call to action, right? It's just much more obvious what this button is and hopefully what it does. If you tap this button, you know what's going to happen. It's going to start a new game. So we've got a button now. Got a bare bones amount of UI in our setup. So I think what we'll do is we'll probably go ahead and just put the title up at the top, and then we'll leave the table view for later, so we can kind of jump into the game a little bit, because we can't show anything in the leaderboard until we have game scores, and we don't have any of that yet. So let's just skip over that for now, and we'll put the title at the top so you know what game it is, and then we'll come back later and we'll add in that table view for the displaying of the scores. So all that's really left is just to create a title, right? To create a label somewhere on the screen that tells you what game you're playing. So we're going to pull up the library, Command-Shift-L, and we're going to pick label from the list. A label is just a simple view that displays text. Very straightforward. That's all it does. So we're going to drag a label on the screen, get it more or less where we want it to go. And we're going to change the name, if I can type properly. We'll change it to Simon. That's the game that we're making. So if we look at the example, we can see that it is much bigger than that and also a much heavier font weight than that. So let's go ahead and change that as well. I'm going to go over to the same little font attribute system, change this to heavy, make it much thicker, and then we're going to jack the size up on this to 60. So it's much more prominent. Now you might be thinking, well, why is it black in the design and it's white, white background, black text over here, and it's black background, white text over there? Well, what you can do is you can actually support both light mode and dark mode in iOS 13. So that's a new feature as of last year. And what's really cool is not only can you actually support that so that when you run the app, it works that way, you can even look at and see what your design is going to look like in dark mode as a preview. So if you click on this little button here towards the bottom that has View As, the View As control lets you actually change what the preview looks like. So if I wanted to see what this looked like on an iPhone 11 Pro, I could do that. If I wanted to go to, let's say, an iPhone SE, much smaller screen, I could do that. If I wanted to go way up to an iPad, I could do that too. And I could change the display, the preview of how it looks, and it will adjust as necessary. So we'll go back to the 11. So you can, without even running it, you can actually see what your interface is going to look like on different sized devices. You can also change what's called the interface style and let you see, at this point we only have two styles, light mode and dark mode. So we're going to change to dark style and you can see what happens. And what's really cool is that it basically works out of the box. I don't really have to do much to make this supported if I'm using kind of standard setups. So in the view, I've got as my background color of the view, it says system background color. This is another one of those semantic colors I talked about. It's a new thing in iOS 13. And system background color is in theory a single color, but it's actually defined as two different colors. It's white when you are in light mode, and it is black when you're in dark mode. So if you change it, if you set it to that, then you don't have to worry about keeping track of, am I in light mode, am I in dark mode, which color should I use? It'll just figure it out. Same thing with labels. I have my label color. The default label color now is actually a color called label color. And label color is black in light mode and white in dark mode. So it, again, automatically knows how to convert back and forth. So we're going to be able to support light and dark mode in this game without really having to do hardly any work on our part to do that, because we're just going to use the semantic colors and the the support is built right in. Okay. So we just need to get this thing constrained, the title, and then we can actually move on to the game itself, the board itself, and start to work with that and try to get something running. So let's get this constrained. What I want is I want this constrained in the middle of the screen, going left to right. So in the X direction, I want it centered. And then I want it just basically a certain number of points down from the top. So I'm going to add a constraint with this little bar graph button. The tooltip on it is align. And so if we select the label first and then click the align button, and then we say center horizontally in container, we just turn that constraint on and we say add one constraint. That will then create a constraint on this label that makes sure that it's centered on the screen in the X direction. If you want to observe the constraints that you're adding to a given view as you do it, you can go to the size inspector, which is the little ruler, and you can see right here about middle way down the screen, there's going to be this list of constraints that get added. So right now, we just have the one, Align Center X Super View. But as we add more, you'll see more being added. So one more, just to get it constrained from the top. The way that this works in general, this is what I tell my students to do, is whenever you're constraining something, always remember that a view has to be constrained in 4 ways: the X and Y position, and the width and the height. When I say X and Y, I mean the upper left corner. All views on iOS are always they originate their upper left corner at 0, 0. So the upper left corner of any given view is its origin. And then you've got also a width and a height, and that's how you define any given kind of rectangle on the screen. So we've constrained at this point the X, right? We've said that the X of this thing, really the center of it, is centered with the middle of the screen. So there's X, but we still need a Y, and then we also might need a width and a height. So the reason why it's red and why you have a little red circle here is because it's saying you haven't given me enough rules to fully constrain this thing. So I'm not going to be happy about that until you do that, right? It's giving you that warning that you're missing some constraints. That's typically what red means. It can mean you have too many, but most of the time it means that you don't have enough. So we're going to add one more constraint. We're going to use the TIE Fighter, and we're just going to pick a top constraint and say that it's going to be, let's see, how much is it? I think it's 40, no, 80. So we're going to pick 80 here. We're going to say top constraint, 80 points, add. And what that does, it says that the top of the label is going to be 80 points away from the top of the screen, or in this case, the top of the layout guide, the safe area layout guide, that thing I was talking about where it keeps you away from the top and the bottom. So at this point, red is gone, right? We're all good. There's no more errors. There's no more problems. But we didn't constrain width and height. So why is it not complaining about that when I just told you that you have to have all 4 things constrained? Well, you do, but there are some things on iOS that have what are called an intrinsic height or an intrinsic width, an intrinsic size, kind of more generally. And labels are one of those things. So labels have what's called an intrinsic size, and that means that the width is defined by how many characters you place in the label. It just figures out how wide it should be based on how many characters you put in there. And then the height is defined by the font size. So if it's a very large font, obviously it's a taller label. If it's a very short font, then it's a smaller label. So the width and the height are intrinsic in this case. We don't need to constrain them because it can just derive that from the label itself. The X and Y, we've actually constrained with rules ourselves. We have align center X and align top. So we have a complete, for now, a menu. And if we run this as is, we'll run it as an iPhone 11 just so that it's the same sort of shape. We should be able to see the fruits of our labor here. We should be able to see the menu showing up with the big new game button. And so it has to boot up the simulator. So it's doing that right now. The simulator is actually a full-blown sort of mini self-contained version of iOS running on my Mac. And that's why it actually has to boot up, because it is not just a program running. It's like a full little mini iOS environment that is simulating the use of iOS on my Mac. You can also plug your iPhone in to your Mac and actually run your apps and your games directly on your device. But of course, if I did that, you wouldn't be able to see it. So we're using the simulator tonight so that you can also see it as it runs. So once it boots up, it should show the menu. I'm going to go and leave that for now. We'll come back to it when it's done. Or it's going to come right back and assert itself and say that it's ready. Okay, so this is our menu. You can see we've got Simon, we've got a new game, looks good. I can even simulate dark mode by, on my keyboard, I press Command-Shift-A, and that's a keyboard shortcut to flip the mode from day to night or night to day. So we can see that it works fine, looks good in dark mode. And if I go Command-Shift-A again, it goes back to light mode. And again, we can see that it works fine. So we're making progress. Got something going here. The next step is going to be to create our game board. We can work on the game logic, but without the board, you won't be able to interact with it at all. So I feel like getting the game board built next probably is the next best thing. And that means we probably are not going to get to any code tonight, but that's okay. We've got plenty of time. We've got more sessions to continue working on this. So let's just see if we can get the game board started, and then we'll kind of go from there. So this is a single, what's called a single scene that in the storyboard that is one screen's worth of content. We want to be able to show a full game board once they press the new game button. So we need an entirely new scene to do that. It's found in the library. So again, Command-Shift-L or that little plus button in the upper right corner. And we're going to choose View Controller from the list. I'm going to just type in View Controller. And you can see I have an example of that right here. I'm going to click on that and drag one of these in. And this gives me a whole new screen to work with. So now I can add whatever I want to that. And I'm going to make it look like this, right? Like that right side screen with the big colored squares and then like the end game button, all that stuff. So let's work on the big game buttons first. That might actually be all we can get to tonight, but let's work on getting those game buttons, the red, green, yellow, and blue buttons figured out and constrained properly, because it isn't just a matter of putting some big rectangles on the screen and calling it done. We actually want them to look a particular way, and we also want this game board to be able to resize itself based on the size of the device. Because one thing that we don't really have control over is what physical devices our game runs on. On iOS, you can target different versions of the OS, and therefore you can kind of make sure that really old devices don't run your app because they simply can't run that newer version of iOS. But as far as individual device types, there's not really a way to differentiate between them except to say iPhone versus iPad. So you can't really say, I only want iPhone 10 and newer to be able to run my game or my app. In this case, as long as the device supports iOS 13, it's going to be possible to download your app or your game from the App Store and run it. So you want to make sure that from a design perspective that your designs are adaptable, right, to different size screens. Okay, so let's work on the buttons. We need some more buttons. So I'm just going to grab a button from my library and drag it in. And then this is another kind of top tip for you for doing this, especially if you're going to be doing the same thing over and over again. You're going to be creating something and then creating it again. It's going to look either identical or very similar. Drag a single one in, right, and configure it, and then duplicate that. Don't drag a fresh unconfigured one in and have to redo all those steps. Create one and configure it the way you want it to, and then just duplicate that same thing. So for this button, what we want is we want a button that doesn't have any text. So I'm just going to go over here and delete the text from the title from the button, and now it's just a plain sort of white box. And then we want to give it a color. So I'm going to come down here to background and change this to, make this the red one. So I don't know why it keeps doing this where it doesn't paint the thing. I'm going to pick red here, system red color. And then once I have that, I've now got a button that works a little bit better, that works more the way that I want it to. What did I base this off of? Yeah. So now what we're going to do is we're going to duplicate this. So I'm going to click on this, make sure it's highlighted, and then Command D. Command D will duplicate that button, and now I have two. And all I have to do is come over here and change this to green, and now I have a green button. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to try to get these set up to be next to each other, and then I can take that system that I create and I can duplicate that for the lower two buttons. Again, I'm trying to not necessarily have to do a lot of repeating of the same commands again and again. So I'm trying to kind of minimize that. If I click on just an area of my canvas and I drag over these buttons, I can highlight multiple things. So if you want to do a multi-highlight in your storyboard, you can just, find somewhere that doesn't have any controls and just click and drag, and you can create this box that lets you drag over multiple things. Okay. So we're going to come over here to the little tiny buttons in the lower right corner. We're going to pick the one that is a box with an arrow in it, and that's the embed in button. We're going to take those two things that we just made, the red and the green buttons, and we're going to embed them in a stack view. And a stack view is just simply a control that lets you arrange multiple items together in a stack, right? Either in this case, a horizontal stack, or you could make them a vertical stack. I can just change this to vertical, and it will switch me over and show them as a vertical list or as a horizontal list. But it basically lets you have like this highly ordered collection of things. So if you have a grid of something, right, a list of something, either horizontally or vertically, it's a great organizational structure to bring those together and make them sort of fall in line. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just make sure that my attributes are set up correctly. We've got horizontal, that's right. I want these left to right. We've got an alignment that needs to be center. We're going to center these within the stack view. And then a distribution, which is going to be fill equally. So we're going to make sure that of the available space inside the stack view, I want these buttons to fill up that space equally. The last thing is the spacing. The spacing gets inherited from when you created the stack view. So at the time that I did it, there was apparently 78 points of space between them. So I'm going to just change that to 10. I don't need that much space. That's too much space. I want them to be closer together. So 10 points is good enough. And now you can see I have a little stack view with little buttons, red and green, with a little bit of space, that 10 points of space between them. The way I make them bigger is I'm going to add constraints to the stack view itself. And what's kind of cool about stack views is that it basically eliminates work. So rather than having to constrain each individual button with its own set of rules, I can put them in a stack view together and then just constrain the whole stack view. And it's just, generally speaking, less rules to have to add, and therefore less overhead to both have to do, right? It's less work to do, and it's less to break, right? There's less things that could go wrong because there's just literally not as many rules. So let's go ahead and add some constraints to this stack view. Let's see. So we actually need to add, the way that I did these constraints was to do them from the bottom to the top. So we need to go ahead and make the stack view for the other two buttons. We'll constrain those, and then we'll constrain these to that. Typically, what you generally do with auto layout is you kind of pick a control or a view inside your canvas that kind of is like the anchor, right? It's the thing that basically is anchored to the screen in some way, and then you don't have to do it this way, but you can then anchor everything else off of that, and that way they all kind of move as a system, which is nice, and that's just generally the approach that I take. So apparently when I designed this originally, I did the blue and yellow buttons first, and then I did the red and green. So what we'll see here is an example of not having to duplicate this work, right? I'm going to click on and make sure the stack view is highlighted. Command D, it makes a complete copy of everything, both the buttons and the stack view, which is super nice. It's already configured. All I have to do is click on the individual buttons and just change their color. And I've got an automatic set up with the other ones. So we're going to pick yellow and then blue. There we go. So this one we're going to constrain, and we're going to constrain it against the bottom of the screen. It's basically going to grow from the bottom up towards the top. So what we're going to add is, let's see, click on the other one. We're going to add some constraints to this stack view that contains the yellow and the blue buttons. And we're going to say that the leading and the trailing need to have 10 points of space between the edges of the screen and then the edges of the stack view. So that should pull the stack view out towards the edge of the screen. And then we're going to add a bottom constraint. We could have done it just then, but we're going to do it now. And we're going to make it 0 so that it's basically hugging the bottom edge of the screen, or the bottom edge of the safe area if we're on a device that has a safe area like we see here. that is not actually the bottom of the physical screen. It's just sort of near the bottom. Okay. So there we go. We've got it pulled wide, and we've got it towards the bottom, but it's too short, right? It's not tall enough. And so for that, we're going to set it up so that they're all going to be the same height as each other, and then we're going to set one of them to be a particular height. So let's get this other stack view constrained, and then we'll worry about changing their height. And you kind of see what happens. It's going to snap into place, which is pretty cool. So for the other stack view, the one that contains the red and the green buttons, we want them basically just to sit right on top of the other buttons, and then also pulled to the edges like the other ones were. So we're going to say for this one, leading and trailing, we're going to do that same 10 points. And then the bottom, we're going to pick also 10. So we're going to say bottom and then 10 as well. And you can see that then pulls that stack view wide and makes them sit 10 points off the bottom edge there. By making all of the margins 10, it creates this nice visual symmetry. And in general, visual symmetry is a good thing. You'll notice that pretty much all of Apple's stuff is visually symmetrical, I'm sure in no small part due to Johnny Ive's influence. Whether you like that or not is up to you, but that is kind of a generally agreed upon good design standard to go by, is visual symmetry. So we're making the left and right edges, right, the margins the same. And in fact, with the 10 points of space inside the stack views, and then also the 10 points of space between them vertically, we end up with a nice grid, right? It creates a grid for us, which is super handy. It just looks the way you might expect it to look. Okay. So now what we're going to do is we're going to create constraints that make it so that all of the buttons are related to each other and that they all have the same height. So how I'm going to do that is I'm going to hold down the control key on my keyboard. I'm going to click on the blue button and I'm going to drag. With the control key held down, you get this little line that you can then relate the button to other things. I want to relate it to the yellow button. I'm going to let go of everything, the mouse and the control key. And I'm going to say that they have the same heights, equal heights. So now if we look at the constraints, we can see that this individual blue button has a constraint that makes it the same height as the other button. They're all called button because I didn't give them a name. So they're all the same name. But they're related to each other. Now, if I hold down the control key and I relate the blue button to the red button, I'm going to say equal heights. And then the same thing for the blue button to the green button, equal heights. So now the blue button has 3 constraints on it relating itself to all the other buttons as having the same height. The thing is, though, it didn't change anything, right? We didn't get any taller buttons. It's because the blue button is as tall as it is, and so that's why all the other ones are the same size. I'm going to add one more constraint, and it's going to make all of these suddenly do what I want. So I'm going to click on the blue button one more time, Control, click, and drag over to the view, just the kind of the canvas, the area, the white area. And I'm going to choose equal heights. And what that does is it makes in iOS, in Xcode 11, it makes you have what's called a proportional height. So you can see here, we've got the 3 that connect to the buttons. Then we have this other one that says proportional height to view. And the multiplier is this tiny, tiny amount, right? It's 0.03 and some extra change. If we change this to 0.4, we're going to say that we want to take the height of the screen, multiply it by 0.4, a little less than half, and then apply that value as the height of the blue button. As soon as I do that, it does it to the blue one, and then because all the other ones are designed to match, they also become the same height. So suddenly it just stands up and I have the buttons that I need in the right size. And as said in the chat, right, this is definitely not the only way that you could solve this problem and the only way you could lay this out. There's probably at least, I would guess, probably a half a dozen ways you could do this, because you could use stack views, you could not use stack views, you could arrange them so that they're all the same height, you could all make them individual. There's a variety of ways that you could do this so that they look like, it looks like this when you're done. This is just the way that I've chosen to do it. So now we have 4 buttons on the screen. They all have different colors, and they're all in a grid, and they take up most of the screen. By picking 40, right, 40% of the height of the screen, that creates roughly 80% of the screen being used. It's technically a little more because there's also the margins between them. But in general, we're using up about 80% of the screen. And that leaves just enough room at the top to add the extra things we need, the labels and then the button that ends the game. I chose it this way in part to try and give it sort of a similar flair to the original game. Those buttons were actually curved, and it was a circular game. The actual physical item was circular, so they were kind of this like circular pie pieces. I'm not going to bother with anything like that complicated. We're going to create a digital version. So really what I want is I just want it to be easy to tap. I want to have these buttons be nice and large so that whether it's a little kid playing the game or an adult, either way, it doesn't require a ton of dexterity to sort of hit the tap targets. They're nice and big and easy to tap. That's the point of this game. So I decided to make those as prominent as possible. And that's something you want to worry about when you're making your own games and your own apps, right? Is think about the user that's going to use them, and then try to maximize the usefulness of any given screen or any given control for that person, right? That particular person in your audience, and also think about when and how they are likely to use your app, and factor that into how you design it as well. So in this case, it's probably going to be a pretty casual game. They're going to pick it up, play it for a little bit, probably get stuck and make a mistake. I'll come back to it later. You want it to be easy, right? So the new game button is super easy, and then the actual playing of the game is also super easy, nice and big. All right, so let's go ahead and throw our labels in and our button, and then that's probably going to be the end of it for today. And I will, of course, show you how to get this up on GitHub as well. And then when we come back next time, we can work on actually getting this to do something fun. I said I wasn't going to skip any of the steps, and I'm not going to. And so as you can see, app building isn't always all about the fun part, right? Necessarily getting it to do something interesting and be able to play back the app, right, and get it to do different things. Some of it is boilerplate, which is essentially what we're doing here. We're creating the UI. It has to be done in order to make the game useful. So we have to spend some time on it. Let's go ahead and grab a couple of labels. We'll just bring two of them in here. Same thing, Command-Shift-L brings up the labels, and then kind of put them roughly where we want them to be. One of them is going to display the level information. And I'm making up some of these rules here. I don't think that the Simon game ever had a screen. Maybe it did at some point, but I don't think it did. It may have talked to you. I didn't actually ever have a Simon game. I just saw it on TV. I'm making up this level thing. It may or may not have been part of the original game. But the idea here is just to kind of give the user an indication of how far they've gotten. So to me, a level is how many lights are part of a sequence. So level 1 would be a single button lights up. Level 2 is 2 buttons light up, and then 3 and 4 and 5. So if you look at the top here and you see the level, you can tell how many lights are part of that particular sequence, part of that particular level. So that's what we're using that for. And then this one is for the score. So we're just going to use 100 points as an example. We're going to change this text, of course, in our code to display the accurate information, but this is just a way to get an idea of what goes in each of these things. I'd like to make this stuff a little bit more prominent, so I'm going to change my level label to be, instead of just the standard font, it's going to be semi-bold. So we're going to go to a heavier font weight, and we're going to up this to 20 points, make it a little bit easier to read. And then the points are going to be even bigger because that's kind of more important. Generally speaking, you want your most important information to probably be either the biggest or at least the easiest to find. We're going to pick semi-bold as well, and we're going to go all the way up to 25. Make it nice and easy to read. Something my dad, I'm sure, would want me to point out to you is that if you are a young person and have good vision, or if you just have good vision in general, you might be inclined to make things tiny because you can read them fine. And he would tell you as he looks at his phone, right, with all the text blown up, because his close-up vision isn't as good as it used to be. It's good to have things that are prominent, that are easy to read. It makes it so that not only people with good vision can understand it and read it, but also anybody who might not have great close-up vision can still enjoy your game. So we're going to select both of these labels, and we're going to do the same thing that we did to the buttons. We're going to add them to a stack view, and that's just because it just makes it easy to lay them out. So stack view, and you can see it just like immediately adds order, right? It immediately adds order and precision to the labels. It makes them line up nicely, and it's just easier to deal with. So it actually made some intelligent guesses here. It guessed that our alignment should be trailing, meaning the trailing edges of the labels should be aligned, which is what we want. Because the points label is going to get bigger and smaller, right? Wider and skinnier, depending on how many points are being displayed there. We go from a single digit to double digits to triple digits. And the level also will gradually get wider. If they get to level 10 or higher, it's going to be a little wider, right? So, but nonetheless, we want it all aligned on the trailing edge. It guessed distribution of fill, which is fine. And then it even guessed, in my case, because of the way I laid it out, a spacing of 8. It's what I want as well. So it turns out the guesses were very accurate. It's what I want. But if it's not, you can just change that stuff. And so then all that's left is just to kind of constrain it, right? Make sure that it's constrained to the screen. And so we're going to add a trailing constraint here. And we're going to set this to 20. And 20 is actually more than what we used for the buttons, where we used 10 for the buttons. And that's going to make the level and the points readouts be a little inset from the buttons. That's actually kind of on purpose. It helps offset them, makes it a little bit easier to have them stand out as compared to the buttons themselves. And hopefully makes it so that they're it's really glanceable. We want that to be glanceable, not going to spend a lot of time looking at that area, but they want to kind of glance at it and then go back to continue to play the game. All right, so we've got our trailing, and now we're going to create a top. So in fact, we're going to do a top constraint, and that will be 0. So 0 points away from the top of the screen, in this case, the top of the layout guide, because we are looking at a preview of a phone that has the extra stuff at the top. Okay, so there is our level and points information. And so we have just one thing left, and then we'll be all done for this evening. That's the end game button. So we're going to bring a button in. I'm going to change the text of that button to say, end game. There we go. And then we're going to make it match the design of this one, right? Something else that's important to do is to be consistent with the way that you present controls. So we established on the first screen of the game that buttons that are part of the menu are purple. And so we want to keep that theme going forward in the rest of our app so that it's very clear what does what, right? Like basically most of our app is button, right? There's most of the app itself actually is a series of buttons. So we want to make sure that it's very clear that some of these buttons are for playing the game, and some of them are for controlling the game, right? Controlling the state of the game, starting a new game, ending a game. So just arbitrarily, we've decided that purple is going to be the color of buttons that are for controlling the game, and then the red, green, blue, and yellow buttons are going to be used to play the game. This, of course, is not taking into account people who might be colorblind, and there's different kinds of colorblindness. So to make this fully accessible, what would be great is to probably have modes somewhere in the settings screen to let you change the colors to be more colorblind friendly. And there's actually a couple ways to do that. And if we have time, we can maybe get into that and try and add a settings screen to let you do that. You can also add texture or like a design to the buttons, stripes and stuff. That also helps people who have colorblindness to discern the different things, because oftentimes if you have normal vision, what looks completely obviously different to you does not look obviously different to people who have colorblindness. And so that would hinder people from playing this game. And if we want to maximize the number of people who can play, we want to be as accessible as possible. So for now, we're going to leave it, but if we have time, we'll come back and we'll try and add in that support as well. So let's just go ahead and make this match. Background is purple. We're going to use a system indigo color. Going to change the text color to white, wherever it is, down here. And then we're going to change the font Actually, I think we might leave it alone. Let me see. We just make it a little bit bigger. So it's 15. We're going to make it 20. So that it's nice and clear what this thing does. So let's go ahead and constrain this, and then we'll be done for today. Yeah, like was said in the chat, if you can get to 100 points, you're very good at Simon. That's very true. All right, so let's go ahead and constrain this button. So we need a leading, where we need to push it off the left edge of the screen. That's going to be our X. We need a Y of some kind. And then we also need, we don't need a width or a height because buttons have an intrinsic size, but we do actually want to change its default size. We're going to make it wider than it would otherwise be because right now it's very, very near the left and right edges, and it just looks bad, right, being so close. So we're going to add some margin to that, and we're going to artificially change the width. So we're going to add a width constraint to do that. So we got leading. Let's see. It's going to be 20. Set up a leading constraint of 20 points. That's our X. We're going to set up a width, and that's going to be a proportional width. So we're going to say Control-click on the button and drag to the view. And we're going to choose equal widths. And like I said, on Xcode 11, it interprets what you've done as not an equal, but as a proportional width. So it just inherits whatever's already there, which in this case, apparently this button was roughly 22% as wide as the view. We're going to modify that to an even 30%. And that will stretch out the button a little bit to make it just have a little more breathing room on either the left and the right side. So we've got now our X and our width. What's left is the height, which we can ignore in this particular case because it has a height already intrinsically. And then we need a Y. So the Y is going to be, in the Y direction, top to bottom. Where should this be positioned? We're going to Control-click on this and drag over to the stack view, and it's kind of hard to click on the stack view itself. You can end up inadvertently choosing one of the labels inside. So make sure that when you're dragging like this, that it actually says stack view before you let go so that you've got the right thing. And we're going to pick center vertically. And that means that the button is going to be vertically aligned with the two labels over on the right. It's one of the other cool things about using a stack view is that you can make two things or multiple things inside the stack view align with one thing on the other side, either vertically or horizontally, and they will align as a group rather than aligning individually. Another advantage of using a stack view there. So there's our endgame button. There's one more thing that we need to do, and that's to add, we need to add a trailing constraint. The reason why is because of this. If we look over here, this sort of middle pane that you see when you're in the storyboard, this is called the document outline. And it gives you kind of a rundown of all the stuff that's in your view, which is nice. It lets you see them kind of as a list. But it gives you helpful hints and warnings and things when you have stuff wrong. So we've got a warning right now. It's saying that if you were to look at this entire text, it says the trailing constraint is missing. And basically, the reason why it's mad that we don't have a trailing constraint is what if the text of this button changed and got longer? Because let's say we translated this app into a different language and the phrase endgame was a longer set of characters in that language. If that happens, then what would happen is the button would just get wider to no end. It would just get wider and wider and wider just to fit whatever was in there, and potentially it could bump into this stack view over here, and then it would clip. Basically, they would interact, they would bump into each other, and they would not be able to display both things. So one would get clipped and covered with the other one, and that just is, it's bad design, right? It makes it so that they can't play nice. And so because of localization, for the most part, you'll get warnings like this if you have text and you don't have constraints on either side to prevent it from getting too wide. It can cause, collisions and other problems. So we're going to add an additional constraint, not because we need it specifically for the layout, but because we want to make sure that we future-proof this in case we localize it into other languages. We don't want this button to get too wide. So we're going to add a constraint that is a trailing constraint. We're going to set it to 8 points, which is kind of the minimum value between any two things on iOS. It's just the number that was chosen for that. And then we're going to make this constraint. So if I go to the constraint, the trailing constraint, and I click edit, I can change obviously the attributes of it. 8 points is fine, but I want to change the constant value here to be greater than or equal to, meaning that the amount of space between those two things, the stack view and the button, can be more than 8 points, but it can't be any less than 8 points. So it's basically kind of a stopgap. It's preventing the button from getting too wide so that it can't end up running over the other stuff on the screen and causing problems where you can't see the level anymore. All right, so that is it. That's our design. That's all of our constraints. We'll go ahead and add one more thing just so we can preview this. We can actually see the game board running on the device. And how we're going to do that is we're going to connect these two screens together. So what we want is when the new game button gets tapped, we want that other screen to display. So the way that you do that on iOS is, one way anyway, is you click with your control key on the button here, and we drag to the view. And so we go from button in one scene to the screen of another screen, right? Another view. And we get this menu. And it lets you pick a segue. So we're going to pick the present modally segue. And what you'll notice is it draws a line between the menu screen and the game board screen. And so now they're connected. Whenever the new game button is tapped, we're going to see, it's going to show the other view automatically. On iOS 13, they changed the way this works, and you can see now that the presentation of it is like this sort of card view where it basically hides, it shrinks and lowers the previous view and then makes the other one slide up and kind of gives you this like three-dimensional card look. It's cool, but not really the look that we're going for on this game. So we're going to click on the segue itself, and we're going to change the presentation to full screen, which is basically the old way of doing it. And it just looks better for our game. You could decide that you like the new style, and that's totally fine. But for our game, this just looks better, so we're going to keep it like that. And what we can do now is we can actually run the game, and we can press the new game button, and we can see that other screen, and we haven't written any code yet. All we've done so far is just really working the storyboard. We're going to hit new game, and we can see now the game board. It doesn't really do anything, right? There's no code to back up all these buttons. And there's no logic to increase the points or anything, but we at least can see the game as is. So we went a little long, sorry about that, but what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go ahead and put this on GitHub so you can get to it, and I'll post that link in the chat. And then what we're going to do is as we build this game, I'm just going to keep adding to that repository. So if you want to follow along, that's awesome. If you want to just watch and then grab the code later, that's cool too. Whatever works best for you. So let's go ahead and get this up on GitHub. The way that we're going to do that is from the terminal. Apparently I've got an update. That's fine. Okay, so I'm going to go to my documents folder, and then I'm going to jump into the Simon folder, which is where this project is stored. And so you can see I've got two files. I've got the Simon folder that has all the code in it, and I've got the other file called the simon.xcodeproj. That's just a file that when you click on it, it opens the project for you in Xcode. So if I type in git status, I can see that helpfully Xcode created a repository for me automatically, but it didn't do anything other than just creating it. So since it was created, a whole bunch of things have been edited, right? I've changed the storyboard, and then Xcode has also changed a couple of other files as well. So I want to update the repository with the information that was changed and create a new save point, right? A new spot in my repo that has the state of things now rather than the state of things when I first opened the project. However, there are some things in here that I don't really want. I don't want to track some of this stuff. So I'm going to add something called a git ignore. And a git ignore is a way to tell GitHub that you don't want to track certain things. I'm going to pull this up on my other screen and then bring it over here so you can see it. This is a really cool website. You can do this as part of the GitHub creation itself too, but this also works. Gitignore.io is a really nice website that helps you to create gitignore files that you don't really have to think about all the individual elements. You can just say, I have a product that's like this, and then it will create what you need. So I'm using Xcode. I'm on Mac OS, right? I'm running my product on Mac OS, and then I'm also using Swift. So for this project, those are the three kind of keywords that I want to use. I'm gonna hit create, and it just creates for me a file that helps me to ignore all of the crap, all of the stuff that gets created as part of either the Mac or as part of Xcode that I don't want to bother tracking. So I'm just going to Command A to select all that, Command C to copy it, and then come over to my terminal, and I'm going to, whoops, spelled correctly, I'm going to create a gitignore file. So git.gitignore. I'm going to paste all that code in, and then save it. I'm not going to teach you how VI works. VI is an editor you can use at the terminal. It's very old. It's got a million ways to do everything. It is also very difficult to learn. It's very powerful, so I would encourage you to check it out if you haven't already. It's a really awesome editor, but it is pretty terse and pretty obtuse. It takes a while to learn how to use it. So all I did there was just paste in that text and then save it. That's all I did. So now if I type in git status again, it should hopefully not necessarily save some of the stuff that I don't want to save. In theory, I don't need any of the XC user data stuff. Oh, how did I save? So I can't type tonight. Git ignore. So I'm in the file, right? And I'm adding stuff, whatever it might be. I'm going to get rid of that. But I'm adding stuff. When I'm done, all I do is I just press Shift colon. That puts the colon in the lower left corner. And then W is write or save, right? W-R-I-T-E. Q is quit. So write or save and quit. So that writes the file and saves it, or then quits it. Okay. So I think what's happening here is either it's not in here, or could be that it's too late. Yeah, it shouldn't be work. Oh, it's just the workspace settings. Okay, that's fine. Not a big deal. All right, so we're going to go ahead and add all this stuff. So git add dot, we'll add everything. And then I have shortcuts, which I keep trying to type. I don't want to do that. Git status again. We now see all these files have been added. And that means they are being tracked. And now we need to save them. So we're going to save all these things together as a save point. Think of it like a save point in a game. So we're going to say git commit -m means message. And we're going to say, we're going to give the awesome commit message that everyone uses when they start a new project, initial commit. You'll probably notice when you look at other people's projects that there's lots and lots of commit messages that are pretty terrible. They don't really mean anything. And that's kind of a joke in the dev community of having generally pretty bad, like say did stuff, change things, right? Stuff like that. Those are, I would encourage you not to do that. Don't do that. Have better commit messages than that. In this case, we're just going to go with initial commit. I will be better about the next ones that we do when we add features. But we're just going to commit that as is. And so now we're ready to take this repository and put it on GitHub. And what that does, it makes it so that it's public on the internet. Anybody can get to it, and that includes all of you. So we're going to do that by using this friendly command, hub. If you check out hub.com, it's a command line tool you can install on your Mac, and it gives you a bunch of extra power on top of Git. So GitHub is the company that has based their whole company around this tool called Git, and they have a bunch of features that they make available on the GitHub website that are not really part of Git as a program. So the hub program, the hub command, basically powers up your terminal and makes it smarter. It makes it so that it can do things that the git command can't do. Like this. Hub create. Oh, you know what? It's because it's a new environment. I don't have hub installed. Okay, so yes, that would work normally, and I'll fix it for next time. It's not set up because I changed shells, and I apparently forgot to do that on my personal machine. So we'll just do it from this side instead. We're going to go to GitHub. And then I'm going to click I'm logged in to GitHub, so I'm going to click on this plus button, new repo. Going to put it on my own personal account, and we're going to call this Simon. And then I'm going to make it public, and we're going to go ahead and create it. And then what's nice is that when you create the repository on GitHub, it actually gives you help. It shows you how to set up the rest of it. So if you hadn't done anything on your computer yet, you could follow these steps to create a new repository on the command line. Or you can clone this down, or you can take an existing repo that you have locally and you can push it to GitHub. And that's what this set of directions does. So I'm actually going to go ahead and copy this line right here and then paste it into my terminal. What is it mad about? I don't know. So that creates a connection between the repository I have on my machine and GitHub. So now I'm going to take all of the work that I've done so far and push it up to the repo. And then I'm going to just refresh the page. And what you get now is I've got a repository that has the Xcode project. It has the getignore file that I made. And it also has this folder that has all the code in it. So that's kind of the basic structure of a Xcode project, an iOS app, is you've got the project file, you've got the folder that has all the code in it, and then you usually have a getignore so that you can ignore things you don't want. So I'm going to grab this link, paste it into the chat for you. So there you go. I will also take that link and put it on the YouTube description when I upload this video so that if you didn't get it here live and you're watching it later, you can grab it then. And otherwise, I will see you all probably on Monday. I need to figure out exactly when we're going to do this again. It'll probably be at least weekly. I'm hoping for 2 times a week. So thanks, everyone, for hanging out, and I will see you all soon.